You know, some stories aren't just stories. They're actually invitations to go a little deeper. So let's dive into a classic story from the Quran and see if we can find some of those pearls. See, sacred texts aren't just instruction manuals. They have layers of meaning waiting for us.
This story has a few distinct layers of wisdom. Today, we're going to explore the first two.
It's all about a group of people who retreat from a corrupt society into a cave.
Which, begs the question, what does a cave actually represent?
The philosopher Plato saw the cave as a prison. But in this story, it's a sanctuary.
And that makes you think, we all have our own caves we retreat into, don't we?
But be careful. These can become prisons, trapping us in a world of shadows, just like Plato's.
Okay, so this next story shifts from our inner world to our relationship with the outer one.
It all centers on this key idea called imanat, a total rethink of what ownership means.
So you have to ask yourself, do you own your possessions, or have they started to own you?
Because when we're consumed by what we have, we can lose the simple joy of just being.
In both these stories, the characters have a huge awakening. For the cave dwellers, their money is worthless.
So if worldly things lose their worth, what's our true declaration of assets?
The story ends with this beautiful list, contrasting two very different kinds of wealth.
It starts with the concrete things, right? The stuff you might list on an official form. But then it shifts to the intangible stuff, the personal things that make a life rich.
The ultimate asset isn't something you can own. It's something you build in other people.
So that leaves us with one final thought. When worldly currency is worthless, what will you have to offer?
All right, today we're going to break down a really powerful idea about one of humanity's oldest metaphors, the cave, and what it tells us about our search for meaning, especially right now in the modern world. So let's just dive right in.
And I want to start by asking you this question, straight up. Where is your cave? Because according to the philosopher Mustafa İslamoğlu, whose work we're digging into, every single one of us has one. It's that inner space we pull back to, that place of solitude, that little corner of our own mind.
But here's the kicker. That inner space, it's not neutral. It's one of two things. It's either a refuge, a place where you can actually recharge, get some clarity, and get ready to face the world, or it's a prison, a place of self-imposed limits and ignorance. So the real question is, which one is yours?
To really get this whole duality thing, we've got to go way back to two foundational stories. Each one is built around a totally different kind of cave. One comes from classic Western philosophy, and the other from the Quran.
Okay, so check out the contrast here. It's pretty wild. On one hand, you've got Plato's famous Allegory. In his story, the cave is absolutely a prison. The people inside are literally chained up, forced to watch shadows on a wall that they think is reality. It's all about ignorance. But then you have the Quranic story of the sleepers, and it's the complete opposite. For them, the cave is a refuge. It's where these young believers run to protect their faith from a corrupt world. For them, it's a sanctuary, a place of freedom where they can get back to what's real. So, all of that brings the question right back to us, here and now. If a cave can be a prison of comfort and illusion, what do those prisons look like in our world today?
Well, our modern caves are pretty sneaky. They're often disguised as things we want, like achievements or just comfort. It could be the perfectly curated echo chamber of your social media feed. It could be the status that you get from wealth or a powerful job. Or it could be as simple as your own cozy little comfort zone where nothing and nobody ever challenges you. Every single one of these can become a prison, trapping us in a world of shadows and stopping us from ever really growing.
And this quote just hits so hard because it points to the most dangerous cave of all, our own mind. Islamoglu calls prejudice the mind's blind well. Just picture that. Once you fall in, your perspective is totally locked. It becomes a prison that you built yourself, where you only see the shadows you expect to see, not the actual reality that's happening outside. The speaker uses this fantastic analogy for this. He calls it living a cuvis, or incubator life. And think about it, right? A baby in an incubator is kept safe from every single germ. But because of that, it can't develop its own antibodies. Its immune system stays weak. Well, when we live in our comfortable little caves, protected from every hardship, we fail to develop what you might call spiritual immunity, that resilience, that toughness we absolutely need to face the real world.
But let's not forget, the cave isn't always a prison. It can be a refuge. The key difference, though, is that the purpose of a true refuge isn't to stay there forever. It's to get you ready to leave.
I mean, just look at the story of the Prophet Muhammad.
His retreats to the Cave of Hira, that wasn't an escape. The name Hira is actually related to the Arabic word for seeking. It was a place for deep reflection, for seeking truth. And what was the very first command he received there? It wasn't, hey, stay here and be safe. It was rise and warn. The cave was the launchpad, not the final destination.
So this whole journey for a meaningful life, it kind of looks like this. First, you find your refuge, that quiet space you need for real introspection. Then you illuminate it. You light it up with knowledge and self-awareness. But then comes the hardest part, the most critical step. You have to gather up the courage to leave the comfort of that cave and go walk a path of purpose out in the real world.
And this all brings us to the final, and maybe the most powerful, lesson from that story of the sleepers in the cave. It's a parable about what we think is valuable and what truly has value. So, the story goes like this. After waking up from a sleep that lasted for centuries, the men were, hungry. They were still stuck in their old reality. So they pulled their money, the silver coins from their time, and sent one guy into town to try and buy some food. And here is the punchline. When he got to the market, he discovered that their money was worthless. It was an ancient currency nobody used anymore. The very thing they believed held all their value, their only means of survival, was worth absolutely zero in this new reality. It was just a handful of old metal.
I mean, that's such a profound metaphor for our own lives, isn't it? We spend so much time and energy accumulating our own modern currencies, chasing wealth, power, fame, status. But the source material is really asking us to stop and think. All of these things can expire. In the face of a real crisis, or at the end of your life, these so-called currencies might turn out to be just as worthless as those ancient silver coins.
So I'll leave you with this final question to think about. When the world changes on you, when all the superficial things we chase inevitably fail us, what will your valid currency be? What's the one thing you have that will always hold its value no matter what? Maybe it's your character, your integrity, your kindness, the good you actually put out into the world. So, what are you really investing in?
Imagine for a second that you have just had, like one of those weeks.
Oh, we all know the kind.
Right. You know the kind. The news cycle is just an endless barrage of outrage. And your responsibilities at work or at home, they feel like they're physically crushing your chest.
Yeah, the sheer noise of existing in the modern world just becomes deafening.
Exactly. And when that happens, you feel this profound, bone-deep instinct to just retreat. To pull the covers over your head, put your phone on airplane mode, cancel all your plans, and just disappear from the grid for a while.
I mean, that's a survival instinct.
It is. But there is a really important, almost dangerous question you have to ask yourself when you do that. And it's a question most of us actively avoid.
Right.
When you retreat into that isolation, are you seeking a temporary shelter so you can recharge your batteries and face the world again? Or are you actually, quietly, building a permanent prison out of your own comfort?
Wow. I mean, that is the pivotal boundary line in human psychology right there.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is the razor-thin margin between necessary restorative self-care and, well, a kind of cowardly self-exile.
Yeah.
And the terrifying thing about that boundary is that it doesn't come with a warning sign. It is a very, very thin line.
I feel like it's so thin that most of us cross it without even noticing. You lock the door to your room, or you mentally check out of a difficult conversation, thinking, you're just taking a quick breather.
Right. You tell yourself, I just need a minute to myself.
Exactly. But then days pass, or weeks, or emotionally years pass. You don't even realize you've locked the door from the inside and thrown away the key. You've completely checked out of reality.
Precisely. We tell ourselves we are just resting. We wrap our avoidance in the language of wellness or setting boundaries.
Oh, totally. Boundaries is the big buzzword.
Right. But often, if we are being brutally honest with ourselves, we are hiding. We are actively avoiding the friction of existence because the friction hurts.
Yeah.
But that friction is also the exact and only place where growth happens.
Which brings us to the absolutely massive source material we are unpacking today on this deep dive. We have a lot of ground to cover. We are diving into a comprehensive, highly philosophical lecture by the scholar Mustafa İslamoğlu.
Yes.
The lecture is titled Surah Al-Kahf, The 5 Layers of Truth. Now, if you are looking at that title, you might immediately think, okay, this is just a theology lesson.
Sure, yeah.
And on its face, yes, it is rooted in Quranic analysis, specifically looking at the 18th chapter of the Quran. But I want to set the stage right now for you listening.
Yeah.
This goes so far beyond a standard theological commentary.
It really does.
We are talking about sociology, behavioral psychology, deeply profound ethics, and universal human conditions. Conditions that apply whether you are deeply religious, fiercely secular, or, anywhere in between.
And that is the whole point of our deep dive today. Our mission here isn't to get bogged down in sectarian theology or academic religious debates. The primary goal is to take this incredible text, strip away the surface-level dogma, and extract the actionable, profound insights that the speaker has hidden within his analysis.
We're panning for gold here.
Exactly. We are searching for universal truth. We want to understand the true nature of human prejudice. We want to completely redefine what wealth actually is. And we want to examine the sheer, terrifying moral courage it takes to step away from the herd, especially when the entire herd is happily marching toward a cliff.
Now, as we get into this, I want to clarify some ground rules about the source material.
Yeah.
The speaker uses some incredibly intense, politically charged, real-world examples to make his philosophical points.
He really goes there.
He does. For instance, he explicitly mentions geopolitical stances regarding the Iranian regime, foreign military interventions, and long-standing divides between religious sects like Sunni and Shia.
Right.
When you hear those examples today, I want to be very clear. As your guides on this deep dive, we are not taking a political side.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing any specific geopolitical viewpoint or taking a stance on Middle Eastern politics. What's fascinating about the author's approach is that he isn't trying to pick a team either.
Yeah, that's key.
He is using these massive, controversial global conflicts as a lens to critique the very concept of tribalism. So, we are going to follow his lead. We're going to look at his arguments strictly to illustrate a broader philosophical point about choosing universal principles over sectarian loyalty.
That's a crucial framework for you to keep in mind as you listen. If you get caught up in the politics of his examples, you will completely miss the philosophy.
Yeah, you'll lose the forest for the trees.
Exactly. His overarching thesis in using those geopolitical flashpoints is to argue that the overwhelming confusion you and I experience in modern life, the reason everything in the news feels so chaotic and exhausting, it stems directly from a lack of internal principle.
We're on board.
Right. We don't have an anchor, so we just drift with whatever our quote-unquote tribe tells us to believe.
Okay, I want to really dig into that. How does he actually illustrate this lack of principles? Because it's easy to say, oh, people are tribal, but what does that actually look like in practice?
He gives a very stark, challenging example that forces his audience out of their comfort zone. He says, look at Iran. If the Iranian regime acts unjustly and oppresses its own innocent citizens, he, as a matter of absolute principle, stands with those innocent citizens.
Okay.
And he emphasizes that he does this regardless of whether those citizens belong to his specific religious sect or not. Their identity doesn't matter to him, their oppression matters.
Right.
But, he continues, if foreign global powers unjustly attack Iran, raining down bombs on a whole population to serve their own geopolitical interests, he stands with Iran.
I have to pause you there because that completely short-circuits the way we are taught to engage with politics and society today.
It totally does.
I mean, we are aggressively conditioned to pick a team. You put on the jersey of your political party, your nation, or your ideology, and you defend that team no matter what they do.
Right, loyalty over ethics.
Exactly. If your team does something terrible, you excuse it. If the other team does something good, you downplay it. What he's proposing requires you to constantly switch sides based on the action, not the actor.
And that requires intellectual consistency, which is, frankly, exhausting. We naturally crave binary choices. Good guys over here, bad guys over there.
It's just easier on the brain.
It is, but his core rule is agonizingly simple and incredibly difficult to practice in the real world. Stand with the oppressed, stand against the oppressor, period.
Wow.
The identity of the oppressor is completely irrelevant. He explicitly states in the lecture, sectarianism is dead. The ultimate goal of all revelation, of all ethical frameworks, is not to create an exclusive VIP club of true believers.
Right.
The goal is simply to make us better humans. If your religion or your political ideology or your personal philosophy isn't making you a kinder, more just human being, you have entirely missed the point of its existence.
And he traces our failure to live up to this standard, our tendency to just fall back into tribalism, straight back to prejudice. But I found his definition of prejudice really striking. He doesn't just call it a bad habit or a cognitive bias. He describes prejudice as the blind well of the mind.
It's a terrifying metaphor if you really sit with it.
It really is. Because
Yeah.
think about falling down a blind well. Once your mind falls down that well, You are cut off from the light.
Yeah.
You can't see anything clearly anymore. You are trapped in the dark, surrounded only by the echoing walls of your own assumptions. And anyone looking down at you from the top, they can't reach you. You are isolated in your own ignorance.
And that metaphor of the blind wall leads directly into one of the most fascinating psychological insights in the entire lecture. It is his deep dive into the concept of Gabet.
Okay, yes, let's talk about that.
Now, this is an Arabic term that is typically, and rather weakly, translated into English as backbiting or gossiping.
Right. And I have to admit, when I first read the word gossiping in the text, my modern brain just kind of glossed over it. Normally, if someone says, hey, don't gossip, we think, okay, sure, it's rude. It's mean to talk behind someone's back. We think of it as a minor social faux pas, like chewing with your mouth open. Or at worst, we equate it with slander, spreading rumors.
But he draws a very sharp, very necessary line there. He clarifies that slander is a completely separate concept. Slander is making up a lie about someone. Slander is fiction.
Right.
Gabet, true backbiting, is talking about something that is objectively true about the person. It is a real flaw, a real mistake they made, but you are bringing it up maliciously behind their back to diminish them.
Wow.
And the speaker asks a profound question. Why is this considered such a massive spiritually destructive crime in ancient texts? Why does the Quran, for example, compare the act of backbiting to something as visceral and sickening as eating the flesh of your dead brother?
I mean, that is a wildly intense metaphor for just talking smack by the office water cooler.
Yeah.
Eating dead flesh. It seems almost disproportionate until you hear his philosophical breakdown of what gossip actually does to a human being.
Yes, and this is where the philosophy gets deeply existential. The profound reason he gives for this intense condemnation is that the true crime of backbiting is that it nails a person in time.
Nails a person in time.
Yeah.
I have to tell you, that phrase just stopped me dead in my tracks when I read the source material.
It is an incredibly powerful way to visualize human interaction. Think about the mechanics of it. When you gossip about someone's past mistake, something they did months or years ago, you are fundamentally refusing to acknowledge their capacity to repent, to learn, to grow, and to change.
You're locking them in a box.
By dragging their past into the present and defining them by it, you are essentially condemning them to permanently inhabit their absolute worst moment. You strip them of their dynamic, evolving human nature, and you turn them into a static object, a photograph of a failure.
Let me bring this right into the lap of you, the listener, living in the hyper-connected modern world. Because when I read about this concept of nailing someone in time, all I could think about was the architecture of the internet and modern cancel culture.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, look at how we behave online. Isn't our entire digital society currently built on this exact ancient crime? We will dig up a 10-year-old social media post, a bad joke someone made when they were a teenager, or a genuine mistake they made in a moment of ignorance, and we use it to define their entire existence today. We literally freeze people in their worst moments and demand that society look at that frozen image forever.
That is the perfect modern parallel. You are taking a dynamic, living organism and treating them as a fossil, and if we connect this to the bigger picture of how reality actually works, treating people as static objects fundamentally breaks human connection because it is a denial of reality.
How so?
Well, on a purely biological level, science tells us that every cell in your face, the lining of your stomach, your skin, has all replaced itself over the last few months or years. You are physically, literally not the same person you were a year ago.
Right.
Your brain chemistry is altered. Your neural pathways have shifted based on new experiences.
We are constantly regenerating.
Exactly. So if we assume that other people do not change morally or intellectually, if we refuse to let them evolve past their mistakes, we are denying the fundamental law of the universe, which is evolution and growth.
That makes total sense.
But here is the truly terrifying part, the psychological trap. If we refuse to let others change, we secretly, subconsciously believe that we ourselves cannot change.
Wait, explain that. How does my judging someone else trap me?
Because the standard you apply to the world becomes the standard your subconscious applies to you. If you believe that human beings are permanently defined by their worst actions, then the next time you make a terrible mistake, you will believe you are permanently ruined.
Oh, wow.
You won't seek growth because you've already decided growth is a lie. By nailing others in time, you build the exact same cross for yourself.
We lock ourselves in the exact same prison we put them in. We become a society that is sworn to never let anyone change. We are obsessed with witnessing their sin, but we absolutely refuse to witness their repentance. It's a complete and total refusal of grace.
And this refusal to acknowledge reality, this tendency to use lazy, cruel shortcuts to judge individuals, it doesn't just stay on an interpersonal level, it bleeds over. It scales up into how we judge society as a whole.
Right.
Which is a perfect transition into the second major theme the source material tackles. We move from the personal prejudice of nailing people in time to the massive societal cop-out of blaming fate for our collective failures.
Yes, the scapegoat of destiny. Or, as the source material beautifully and provocatively phrases it in Turkish, kape felek, which roughly translates to fickle fate or cruel fortune.
Exactly.
The speaker attacks this concept brilliantly, and he doesn't do it with abstract theology. He uses an incredibly vivid, grounded economic example that just cuts through all the philosophical noise and forces you to look at reality.
It's a fantastic example because it deals with brutal, everyday survival. He sets it up with a basic scientific premise. He says, okay, modern science tells us that eating seafood, getting those omega-3 fatty acids, is absolutely crucial for proper brain development, especially in utero and in early childhood. It's an established, undeniable fact.
Yeah, we all know that.
But then he pivots from the science to the sociology, he asks. How can a retired pensioner who is surviving on a meager 20,000 Turkish lira monthly salary in a crushed economy possibly afford to buy fish?
Right.
How can a pregnant mother living in deep systemic poverty afford the baseline nutrition required to properly develop her baby's brain?
And you know what society's default response to that tragic systemic inequality usually is? We shrug. We look at the impoverished mother or the starving pensioner, and we sigh, and we say, well, it's destiny, it's God's will. The world is just unfair. It's just their lot in life.
Right, we pass the buck.
We take human-made, systemic, preventable inequality, and we write it off as God's ledger. We blame the universe.
Which the speaker argues is an absolute moral outrage. It is a slander against the divine. He explains that society essentially invented the concept of kape felek, this fickle, cruel fate, for a very specific, cowardly reason.
Oh, this part was fascinating.
Right. Historically, he notes, folk, poets, and wandering minstrels created this concept of a cruel, arbitrary destiny as a psychological safety valve for the masses.
That is so interesting. You're saying this concept of fate was functionally designed. It wasn't just a religious belief, it was a tool.
Yes, a societal tool. Think about the historical context. If you are a peasant living under a brutal, tyrannical king who is taxing you into starvation, you are angry, you are desperate.
Naturally.
But if you criticize the king, you get beheaded. So what do you do with all that rage? The folk poets gave the people a target that couldn't execute them. Fate. It allowed people to complain, to sing sad songs, to vent their massive frustration about how hard life is without actually having to point a finger at the powerful people who were causing the hardship. You don't criticize the corrupt politician or the greedy landlord or the broken economic system that's hoarding the wealth. You just shake your fist at the sky and curse fickle fate.
It is a completely risk-free form of rebellion.
Precisely. And because it is completely risk-free, it is ultimately useless. It changes absolutely nothing. The king stays on the throne, the landlord keeps the grain, and you keep starving, but you feel slightly better because you yelled at the clouds.
It's like a pressure release valve on a giant industrial boiler. The valve lets off just enough steam to stop the whole machine from exploding, but it ensures that the machine itself just keeps running exactly as it was designed to. The exploitation continues uninterrupted.
Exactly.
So I want to pose this to you, the listener. What does this mean for us today? We don't have wandering folk poets singing about the king, but we do this exact same thing. Think about every time a preventable tragedy happens.
Yeah.
A poorly constructed building collapses in an earthquake because the developers bribed the inspectors. Or a town's water supply gets poisoned by chemical runoff because of deregulation. What do the PR firms and the politicians say? They call it an act of God. They classify it as a tragic destiny.
Because the moment you successfully classify a preventable human-made tragedy as destiny, you completely erase accountability.
It's the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card.
The speaker is adamant about this. We cannot write the failures of human society into God's ledger. If a pregnant mother cannot afford food, the responsibility does not lie with some abstract concept of fate. It lies with us. It lies with the economic systems we vote for, tolerate, and participate in.
Right.
He argues that knowledge of a problem instantly mandates responsibility. Once you are aware that the pensioner down the street cannot afford fish, you are on the moral hook for that reality. You can no longer claim ignorance, and you certainly cannot blame the stars.
But I want to challenge this just a little bit because it feels like a very heavy burden to place on an individual. Are we saying that every single instance of suffering is a systemic failure that we are personally responsible for?
That's a fair question.
Aren't there times when a tragedy truly is just bad luck, a random disease, a freak accident? Where is the line between accepting the tragic nature of mortality and fighting systemic injustice?
That is a very fair pushback, and the philosophy here doesn't deny the existence of natural tragedy or mortality. People get sick, natural disasters happen. The distinction lies in the compounding of that suffering through human negligence.
Okay, I see.
An earthquake is an act of nature. A school collapsing during that earthquake because a contractor used cheap concrete to save money, that is human corruption. The speaker's point is that we are far too eager to place the corruption into the nature category so we don't have to deal with it. We use spiritual or poetic language to excuse massive injustice.
It's spiritual bypassing. We use the concept of destiny to sanitize our own apathy.
Yeah.
But if we are going to stop doing that, if we genuinely want to stop blaming fate, stop nailing people in time with our prejudice, and actually take real, terrifying responsibility for our lives and our societies, we can't just flip a switch.
No, it's not that easy.
We have to start by looking inward. We have to confront our own internal reality, our own hypocrisy first. And that journey inward, that necessary isolation, is beautifully represented by the very first overarching layer of truth in the source material, the cave.
Right. To give the listener the map of where we are going, the lecture structures the entire Surah Al-Kahf into 5 distinct philosophical layers of truth. It is essentially a roadmap of human spiritual and societal development.
Right.
The first layer is the cave, which represents the path and internal discovery. The second is the 2 gardens, representing wealth, ownership, and illusion. The third focuses on Adam and Iblis, dealing with the fundamental nature of good and evil. The fourth is Moses and the sage, exploring the different states of knowledge and patience. And the fifth is Dhul Qarnayn, which tackles power, governance, and justice. For our deep dive today, we are focusing heavily on those first 2 layers, the cave and the gardens, because they form the psychological foundation for everything else. You cannot wield power or understand knowledge until you have mastered your own mind and your relationship to the material world.
So let's walk into the first layer. Let's enter the cave. The speaker makes a really important distinction right away, so we don't get lost in literalism.
Yes. Very important.
When he talks about the cave, he's not just talking about a physical hole in the ground made of limestone or basalt that ancient people hid in. He is arguing that everyone, absolutely everyone, regardless of their background, has an internal cave. We all have this psychological and spiritual space within our own minds that we must retreat to for solitude and reflection.
Yes, the internal cave is a universal human requirement. But there is a massive catch. The cave itself, by its very nature, is dark. It is just an empty space.
Yeah.
If you want to see anything in your internal cave, if you want to actually do the work of self-discovery, you have to bring your own light. You have to bring your own intellectual curiosity, your own spiritual energy, and your own willingness to be honest with yourself into that isolation.
You can't just sit in the dark.
Exactly. You cannot just lock yourself in a dark room and expect enlightenment to magically wash over you. Isolation without intention is just sensory deprivation. It doesn't teach you anything.
To illustrate how this is supposed to work, he points to the historical example of the Prophet Muhammad and his profound use of physical caves. Specifically, he mentions the Cave of Hira, where the first revelations occurred, and later the Cave of Thar, where he hid during his migration.
Yes.
And there's a fascinating linguistic nugget the speaker drops here. The Arabic word Hira actually shares an etymological root with words meaning quest, search, or bewilderment.
I love that detail.
Right. It was literally the cave of the search. It was a place you went when you were overwhelmed by the world and desperate for answers.
It's a beautiful historical detail, but the absolute most profound insight the speaker draws from this history isn't about what happened inside the cave. It's about what happened after.
Okay, tell me more.
He points out a historical fact that is often overlooked. After the prophet received the revelation, after he found the ultimate truth he had been agonizingly searching for in that darkness, he never went back to visit Hira. There is no historical record of him returning to that specific cave for the rest of his life.
Okay, hold on. Stop right there. Because human nature dictates the exact opposite.
It does.
If I had the most profound, reality-altering, deeply spiritual experience of my entire life in a specific location, I would build a shrine there. I would go back every year for the anniversary. People today build monuments on the spots where they had minor epiphanies. Why wouldn't he go back?
Because going back would violate the entire purpose of the cave. The metaphor the speaker is building is incredibly clear. The cave is meant to be a temporary shelter, not a permanent inn. It is a place of discovery, a laboratory for the soul, not a place of permanent residence. You go into the deep isolation of the cave to find the truth, to do the agonizingly hard work of self-reflection, to face your own demons. But once you find the truth, your absolute non-negotiable duty is to take that truth back out into society.
So you can't just keep it for yourself.
Right. The divine command he received wasn't stay here and be enlightened. The command was to rise and warn, to engage with the messy, difficult, corrupt world. If you just stay in the cave, bathing in your own personal enlightenment, your spirituality is inherently selfish and ultimately useless to humanity.
He connects this dynamic to the Islamic practice of itikaf, which is a period of deep isolation and retreat, usually undertaken in a mosque during the final 10 days of the month of Ramadan.
Yes.
He frames this practice not as a way to escape from the responsibilities of reality, but as an essential boot camp for self-care and brutal self-accountability. There's a famous quote he references here: "Account for yourself before you are accounted for." It's about doing a proactive internal audit.
And this is where he offers a really sharp, almost devastating critique of how people misuse religious rituals today. He argues that many people treat their daily prayers, or salat, not as a moment of deep, transformative accountability, but almost like a caricature of a Christian confession booth.
Yeah.
They use prayer as a mechanism to, as he puts it, clear storage space for new sins.
Oh, man. I mean, that is a brutal way to describe it, but it is so accurate to human psychology.
It is entirely accurate. Instead of using the moment of spiritual reflection to genuinely ask themselves, did I live up to my purpose today? Did I treat my employees fairly? Did I act with justice? They treat the ritual as a transactional reset button.
Just punching the clock.
They punch their spiritual time card, clear their conscience, and go right back out into the world to be the exact same terrible, exploitative people they were yesterday. They aren't seeking transformation. They are seeking a loophole. They are using the ritual to avoid the real work.
Let me throw an analogy at you, because while his critique is aimed at religious practice, this feels incredibly relevant to secular life, too.
Absolutely.
I want the listener to think about the modern obsession with the wellness industry. Think about the silent meditation retreats, the ayahuasca journeys, or the 10-day digital detoxes in the woods.
Oh, yes.
People will pay thousands of dollars to go sit in total silence, drink green juice, and find themselves. You are, in a very modern sense, going into your cave.
Exactly.
But if you come back from that expensive retreat and you are immediately horrible to your barista at the airport, and you scream at your coworkers on Monday morning, and you continue to ignore the systemic suffering in your own community, haven't you just used the cave as an exotic vacation? You haven't transformed your character at all. You just took a very expensive spa day for your ego.
That is the exact parallel. The physical action is different, but the psychological evasion is identical. If your time in the cave doesn't make you a better, more empathetic, more just participant in society, you have completely missed the purpose of the cave. You used it as an anesthetic, not a cure. And this intense tension between the need to retreat from a corrupt society and the moral obligation to engage with it brings us to the deeply complex concept of freedom and what the speaker terms the incubator effect.
Let's get into that, because his definition of freedom is probably very different from what most of us are used to. The source redefines freedom by referencing the great sociologist Ali Shariati and his profound concept of the four prisons of humanity.
Yes, a fantastic concept.
Shariati argued that humans are trapped by nature, by history, by society, and ultimately by the self. And the speaker connects this sociological framework to the biblical and Quranic story of Hannah, the mother of the Virgin Mary.
Right. It's a beautiful synthesis of sociology and theology. When Hannah was pregnant, she made a very profound prayer. She prayed to dedicate her unborn child to the temple, to serve a higher spiritual purpose. But the specific wording she used is what the speaker focuses on. She asked that the child be dedicated as a free person, using the Arabic word Muharraran. The speaker emphasizes that in the ancient world, freedom usually just had a legal, physical meaning. It meant you weren't a physical slave owned by a master.
Right. Literal slavery.
But Hannah was asking for something far more radical and internal. She was asking that her child be free from the crushing weight of neighborhood pressure, free from the expectations of society, and critically, free from the restrictive gender roles of her time.
That's massive.
Remember, historically, women were barred from serving in the inner sanctum of the temple. By praying for a free child, she was praying for a human being who would not be bound by the arbitrary prejudices of the era.
She was praying for true independence from the herd. And there is a fascinating, almost shocking anecdote the speaker shares here to illustrate what it looks like to reclaim these deep, radical concepts in the modern world. He talks about an encounter he had with a female Jewish rabbi who was also a professor at the University of Delaware.
Right. He relates that in the middle of a deep academic and theological discussion, this rabbi stood up, looked at him, and proudly called herself a jihadist.
Which, let's be honest, in the modern political and media climate, is a word that instantly sets off massive alarm bells.
Oh, completely.
We have been conditioned to associate that word exclusively with violence, extremism, and terror. To hear a Jewish rabbi use it to describe herself is jarring.
It is intentionally jarring because she was reclaiming the original, profound theological meaning of the word before it was corrupted by modern geopolitics. In the deepest Quranic sense, particularly regarding the concept of jihad-e-akbar, or the greater struggle, the word refers to the massive, agonizing, internal battle to conquer one's own ego.
The inner war.
Yes. It is the struggle to strip away your own ingrained prejudices, to fight your own selfish desires, and to relentlessly strive for truth and justice. It is the ultimate internal war. For a female Jewish rabbi to look at a Muslim scholar and say, I am engaged in that exact same inner struggle, I am a jihadist for truth, it completely shatters all the superficial tribal boundaries we set up between faiths and cultures.
It's a beautiful moment of connection. It's about fighting the internal darkness. And speaking of darkness, the speaker makes a really crucial, brilliant linguistic distinction when describing the corrupt society of ancient Mecca before the prophet migrated. He doesn't just say the society was experiencing a night. He specifically uses the Arabic word zalam.
This is one of those linguistic nuances that changes everything once you understand it. A normal night, the darkness we experience every evening, is simply a temporary absence of the sun. It is passive.
Right, you can fix it with a flashlight.
Exactly. If you light a single tiny candle in a normal night, you create illumination. The light pushes the darkness away and you can see your path. But zalam implies something entirely different. It implies a pure, absolute, suffocating darkness. It is a darkness that is active. It aggressively absorbs and swallows light.
He actually uses outer space to explain this, which blew my mind. I never thought about space like that.
A great metaphor.
We assume space is full of light because the sun is there, but space is just a dark void. The sun doesn't light up the vacuum of space. It's only when the sun's rays hit the particles in our atmosphere that we get a blue, bright sky. Zalam is like the vacuum of space. It represents a society that is so deeply corrupt, so structurally, fundamentally evil, that lighting a single candle of personal goodness does absolutely nothing. The darkness just eats it. Your good deeds are swallowed by the systemic corruption. And because Mecca had become zalam, the prophet and his followers eventually realized that staying and trying to be good individuals wasn't enough. They had no choice but to leave. Migration, or hijrah, became a moral necessity, not just a physical escape.
And here is where the speaker pivots from ancient history to deliver one of the most blistering, uncomfortable critiques of modern privileged individuals. He takes this concept of migrating from darkness and applies it to people today who live in what he calls a couveuse, an incubator, or, in English parlance, an ivory tower. He refers to them as Sweetwater Muslims, or Sweetwater citizens, people who have only ever known the gentle, easy currents of life.
They've never seen the ocean.
Right. They have wealth, they have comfort, and they have extreme security. They live in gated communities, they send their kids to elite private schools, they only associate with people in their exact same tax bracket, and they never ever have to look real poverty, gnawing hunger, or genuine human suffering in the face.
The incubator metaphor is incredible because it operates on a biological level. What happens to a premature baby that is kept in a totally sterile, temperature-controlled incubator for too long?
It survives, but it never develops a functioning immune system. The speaker references the old pragmatic advice from pediatricians. Kids need to get dirty. They need to play in the mud. They need to lick the carpet, so to speak.
Right.
They require exposure to everyday germs and bacteria so their bodies can learn how to produce antibodies. If a child is kept in a sterile bubble and never exposed to a pathogen, the moment they step into the real world, the very first minor virus they catch could be utterly devastating.
And he maps that biological reality directly onto our morality. If you isolate yourself in a wealthy, sterile bubble where you never encounter hardship, where you never see injustice, you never develop a moral immune system.
Exactly. And this is his profound, elegant answer to the classic philosophical problem of evil, the theodicy problem that has troubled philosophers for millennia.
Why does God allow evil?
Yes. Why does God allow evil to exist? Why is the world so hard? Because if you completely remove the possibility of evil, if you remove all hardship, all temptation, and all suffering, you cannot truly choose to be good.
Oh.
Goodness is only meaningful if it is a deliberate choice made in the face of a viable alternative. If you are locked in an incubator where it is physically impossible to do wrong, where you never have to make a hard choice, you aren't a good person. You are just a captive of your own comfort. You have innocence, but you do not have virtue.
So you have to be exposed to the messiness and the danger of the real world to actually test and forge your character. But I have to push back here. I want to play devil's advocate because he is presenting us with a massive dilemma.
Okay, let's hear it.
On one hand, earlier, he says you have to leave the zalim, the absolute darkness of a corrupt society, in order to save your soul. You have to migrate.
Right.
On the other hand, he's now saying you cannot live in a sterile incubator. You have to face the real messy world to develop a moral immune system.
So, which is it? If my society is deeply corrupt, is it my moral duty to stay and fight the darkness, risking being swallowed by it? Or should I flee to the cave? When does fleeing to the cave cross the line from a necessary tactical retreat into cowardly self-preservation?
That is the million-dollar question, and to his credit, the source material does not pretend there is an easy answer. He acknowledges that this is the ultimate paradox of human existence.
Okay.
He frames it as the dilemma of the companions of the caves, the famous sleepers in the Quranic story who fled a corrupt, oppressive tyrant and slept in a cave for centuries to preserve their faith. He asks the audience, is it harder to flee, or is it harder to wake up and face reality?
Both sound pretty hard. Fleeing is incredibly difficult. You have to leave behind your property, your social status, your friends, and your established order. It requires immense sacrifice. But waking up, emerging from the cave, and engaging with a broken, unfamiliar, hostile world is arguably even harder.
It is the eternal tension between preserving your own internal purity and fulfilling your external duty to your fellow human beings. And honestly, looking at how people behave, we go to absolutely absurd comical lengths to avoid answering that hard question. We do not want to face the dilemma of the cave, which leads us seamlessly into how we miss the point entirely, or what the speaker brilliantly calls stoning the unseen.
To set this up, he draws a fascinating comparative analysis between two of the most famous caves in human intellectual history. Plato's cave from Greek philosophy, and the Cave of the Sleepers from the Quranic tradition. In Plato's famous Allegory, the cave represents ignorance. Prisoners are chained in the dark, staring at shadows projected on a wall, completely convinced that the shadows are reality. In the Quranic story, the cave represents the exact opposite. It is a place of enlightenment, a refuge for those who have realized the truth and are hiding from a society that worships shadows.
So they serve totally opposite metaphorical functions. One is a prison of ignorance, the other is a sanctuary of truth. But he points out that they both agree on one massive, undeniable foundational truth.
Yes. They both agree fundamentally that the path of the masses, the consensus of the herd, is almost always dead wrong.
Yeah.
In Plato, the majority is staring at illusions. In the Quran, the majority is bowing to a tyrant. In both traditions, if you want to find the truth, you have to be willing to separate yourself from the crowd. You have to endure the loneliness of being right when everyone else is wrong.
But here is the tragedy of human nature. Instead of focusing on that massive, life-altering, terrifying lesson, the realization that you might need to completely abandon your society's norms to save your soul, what do people actually do when they read the story of the cave?
It's so frustrating.
They obsess over trivial, completely irrelevant details. They miss the forest because they are arguing about the bark on a single tree.
It is maddening to observe. He points out how, for centuries, religious scholars and lay people alike will argue for days on end about the minutiae of the story. They will write volumes debating, were there exactly 3 sleepers in the cave, or 5, or 7?
Doesn't matter.
Exactly. Did they sleep for precisely 300 years, or was it 309 lunar years? Was the dog that guarded the entrance to the cave the 4th member of the group, or the 8th member? And what color was the dog's fur?
He calls this obsession stoning the unseen, using the phrase, Rackman Billgape. I love that imagery. It's like standing in a pitch-black room and throwing rocks at things you can never possibly hit, and things that wouldn't matter even if you did hit them.
It's completely futile.
Because think about it practically. If an angel came down tomorrow and handed you a certificate proving there were exactly 5 sleepers and a brown dog, Would that information make you a more honest person? Would it make you kinder to your spouse? Would it stop you from exploiting your workers? No. It is utterly useless trivia masquerading as deep theology.
To illustrate how absurd and damaging this gets, he brings up modern examples. He talks about how people will send in furious, deeply concerned questions to religious scholars during the fasting month of Ramadan.
Oh, the questions they ask.
They will endlessly debate whether inadvertently swallowing a microscopic bit of toothpaste or chewing flavorless gum technically breaks their fast. They will agonize over this drop of water. But simultaneously, those exact same people will completely ignore the fact that they are taking bribes at their government job, they are underpaying their immigrant workers, or they are turning a blind eye to massive geopolitical injustices.
The cognitive dissonance is staggering.
They obsess over a drop of water but comfortably swallow an ocean of cruelty.
There is a hilarious and deeply tragic historical anecdote he mentions to really drive this point home. He talks about ancient Bedouins, desert nomads, who would fiercely, violently debate the exact religious necessity and the precise methodology of washing one's heels during the ritual ablution before prayer.
Right.
They would argue about the angle of the water and the timing, but the punchline of the story is that these same men didn't even understand basic hygiene, and during the debate, they would sometimes inadvertently urinate on their own heels.
It's just unbelievable.
They were having a high-level, screaming theological debate about ritual purity while lacking the most basic functional common sense of physical cleanliness.
It is the perfect farcical metaphor for misplaced priorities. And if we connect this to modern behavioral psychology, there is a very deep, very powerful defense mechanism at play here. We have to ask, why do we do this?
Why?
Why do human beings universally obsess over meaningless minutia? Why do we invent what he calls needlepoint religion, a faith or a philosophy so tiny and pedantic that it fits on the head of a pin?
Because it feels safe. It's controllable.
Exactly. We do it to actively avoid confronting massive, intimidating moral responsibilities. If you ask a million tiny, irrelevant questions, how many years did they sleep? What color was the dog? Does this exact brand of mint gum break my fast? You keep your brain so incredibly busy that you never have the quiet time required to answer the big existential questions.
You distract yourself from yourself.
You never have to sit in the silence and ask, am I actually a just person? Am I hurting the people around me? Am I living a life of cowardice? Obsessing over the details is a sophisticated way of hiding from God or hiding from your own conscience while pretending to look for it.
Imagine you, the listener, are sitting in a strategy meeting at your company. It's a Tuesday afternoon. The company's main product is failing spectacularly, revenue's down 40%, and everyone in the room quietly knows that massive layoffs are coming next month. It is an existential crisis.
A nightmare scenario.
And what does the management team spend 3 hours arguing about in that meeting? They argue about the exact shade of blue on the new PowerPoint template, or they fiercely debate whether the company logo on the slide should be 5% larger or 5% smaller.
I've been in those meetings.
We all have.
Ah.
They are arguing over fonts while the ship is actively taking on water and sinking. It is the exact same psychological mechanism as the Bedouins and the heels.
Yeah.
Stoning the unseen to avoid looking at the fire right in front of them. We prefer manageable fake problems to unmanageable real ones.
That is a brilliant corporate parallel. We use minutia as a shield against reality, but the terrifying thing about reality is that eventually it always catches up. You cannot hide behind the PowerPoint font forever.
No, you can't.
In the Quranic story of the cave, the sleepers eventually woke up, the isolation ended, and when they finally emerged from their sanctuary and sent one of their members down to the city to buy food, they discovered something profoundly shocking.
Right, the money.
The silver coins they had in their pockets, the wealth they had carefully taken with them when they fled the tyrant centuries ago, were completely worthless.
The coins weren't legal tender anymore. The tyrant was dead, the empire had fallen, the entire economy had shifted. The money they thought was their ultimate security was now just useless ancient metal.
Exactly.
And that realization that wealth is entirely fragile and contextual brings us perfectly to the second major layer of truth in the source material, the two gardens and the grand, dangerous illusion of wealth.
This is where the lecture shifts from internal psychology to our relationship with the material world. This layer explores the concepts of wealth, possession, and what it actually means to own something.
Yeah.
The core thesis here revolves around a critical distinction between two Arabic concepts. Verluk, which means existence, or in a material sense, wealth, is meant to be understood as an eminent, a temporary trust or stewardship, and absolutely not as immediate, absolute, permanent ownership.
This is a radical reframing of how modern capitalism trains us to view everything we have. We are taught to acquire, to possess, and to build fences around what is ours.
Right.
To cut through that conditioning, the speaker quotes a profound realization he heard from a child. I believe the text knows it was his own son. The child was sitting there watching the adults stress and agonize over finances and bills, and the child just plainly observed, money is something that isn't there today but is tomorrow, and is there today but isn't tomorrow.
Out of the mouths of babes. It is such a simple, almost childlike observation, but it perfectly encapsulates the chaotic, transient, inherently unstable nature of capital.
There he does.
The speaker uses that child's quote to define what true psychological and spiritual maturity actually looks like. He says that true maturity is remaining absolutely unchanged in your core character, your ethics, and your kindness toward others, regardless of the fluctuating state of your bank account. If your personality, your ego, or the way you treat the waiter at a restaurant changes just because you got a massive promotion or sudden inheritance, you aren't a mature, self-actualized person. You are merely a reflection of your wallet.
And to show how deeply unnatural and destructive our obsession with permanent ownership really is, he zooms out and looks at human anthropology. He points out a stunning historical link. The discovery of private property in human history coincides almost perfectly with the invention of war.
It is a direct cause and effect relationship. Think about early human tribes. The moment a group of people draws a line in the dirt and says, this specific plot of land and everything that grows on it is absolutely mine and not yours, you have created a border.
Right.
And borders, by definition, require guards to maintain them. Guards require weapons to enforce the exclusivity of the border. And weapons, combined with the inevitable scarcity of resources, inevitably lead to violent conflict.
It's unavoidable.
The illusion of absolute ownership gave birth to the machinery of human warfare. We kill each other over the delusion that we can permanently possess the earth.
Now, I want to pause and be very careful here, and the source material is careful too, because this can easily tip into a dangerous extreme. The speaker is absolutely not romanticizing poverty.
Definitely not.
He is not a mystic telling you to give away all your possessions, go live in a dirt shack, wear rags, and starve for the sake of your soul. He actually quotes Umar, the second caliph of Islam, who famously and fiercely said, if poverty were a man, I'd kill him.
That is a crucial grounding distinction. The speaker explicitly rejects the mysticism of poverty found in some ascetic traditions. He argues that spending your entire life desperately just trying to survive, worrying constantly about how you will afford your next meal or how you will keep the heat on, forces you to live on the biological level of a single-celled organism.
Right. Just basic survival.
Survival is a primal instinct we share with bacteria and amoebas. Human beings are designed for more than mere survival. We are meant to strive for high ethics, for the creation of beauty, for profound intellectual growth, and for the establishment of justice.
You can't do that if you're starving.
Exactly. You cannot write a symphony or ponder the deep philosophy of the universe or organize a political movement if you are starving to death. You need baseline material security to unlock human potential.
Right. So we absolutely need resources. Wealth itself is not the enemy. The danger, the spiritual poison, lies in the delusion of permanent ownership. We start to subconsciously believe that we can control time and outlive our own fragile mortality through the stuff we accumulate.
Yes, it's an ego defense.
He gives two wildly different but equally tragic examples of this delusion. On a macro, historical level, he points to Adolf Hitler, who arrogantly claimed his Third Reich, his massive empire of stolen property, would last 1,000 years. It lasted 10. And ended with him in a bunker surrounded by total ruin.
Right.
On a micro, everyday level, he tells a local story about an 80-year-old man in his own hometown who decided at the end of his life to build a massive, opulent stone mansion.
Yes. The details of that story are chilling. The architect drawing up the plans asked the old man, how long do you want this structure to last? How solid should we make it? And the 80-year-old man, with complete sincerity, said, build it to last 180 years. And if it falls down then, I'll just build another one.
Illusional.
He was a mortal man in his twilight years, completely disconnected from his own impending death, dreaming of a 180-year real estate empire. And the tragic, violent irony of the story is that shortly after the construction began, before he could even move in and enjoy the house, he was struck by a stray bullet from an unknown shooter in a random altercation and died instantly.
It is the universe violently, abruptly reminding us that we don't even own our next breath, let alone the houses we build or the empires we try to establish.
The psychological analysis the speaker offers to explain why we do this is brilliant. He contrasts the concept of passion, using the Turkish word tutku, with love sevgi. In Turkish, the etymological root word for passion relates directly to being taken captive, being bound, or being arrested.
Oh, that's fascinating.
When you view your wealth, your career, or your power with passion, you do not own it. It owns you. It arrests your spiritual development. It imprisons you. True love, on the other hand, liberates you and allows you to hold things lightly.
I love how he visualized this. I want the listener to picture this. Imagine you buy a massive, incredibly expensive, prize-winning racehorse. You're so proud of it.
It's beautiful.
But you become so obsessed with the idea that this horse is yours, and so terrified that someone will steal it or it will run away, that you refuse to let it walk. When you are obsessed with your wealth, the dynamic completely flips. You are no longer riding the horse to get to a destination. The jockey ends up sweating, exhausted, carrying the massive horse on his back just to ensure he doesn't lose it. You become the property of your property.
It is an absurd image, a man carrying a horse, but it perfectly describes the anxiety of the modern billionaire or even just the modern middle-class worker who is drowning in debt to maintain a lifestyle they don't even enjoy.
And this reminds me of an Oscar Wilde quote that the speaker actually brings up in the lecture, which I found so fitting for this exact paradox. Wilde said, "It is immoral to use private property in order to alleviate the horrible evils that result from the institution of private property."
A paradox.
It's this snake constantly eating its own tail.
Yeah.
But I have to ask, how do we actually balance this in the real world? How do you and I, living in a capitalist society, balance the total rejection of romanticized poverty, the absolute need to have resources, so we aren't just surviving like bacteria with the spiritual dangers of unchecked horse-carrying the jockey wealth?
The answer the speaker provides lies entirely in shifting our internal vocabulary and our worldview from milky yet absolute ownership to eminent stewardship or trust.
Okay.
If you wake up every day believing you absolutely own your wealth, your talents, and your power, you will inevitably become an arrogant tyrant, even if only in your own household. You will hoard it. But if you deeply internalize the belief that your wealth is a temporary trust, an eminent, given to you by the universe or the divine to manage for the betterment of others, you hold it loosely. You realize you are just a bank manager, not the bank owner. You become a conduit for resources, not a vault that hoards them.
But the massive problem we face today is that we've completely destroyed the vocabulary required to understand stewardship. We don't even have the words for it anymore. Which brings us to the final, deeply poetic section of the source material, the profound corruption of language and the ultimate asset declaration.
The speaker is incredibly passionate, almost angry about the specific point. He argues that modern society hasn't just lost its morals, it has actively assassinated its most deeply meaningful phrases.
Assassinated.
Yes. Words that were originally designed to remind us of our moral limits and our ethical duties have been completely hollowed out and turned into jokes. Take the incredibly common phrase, inshallah, which translates to, if God wills. Originally, this was meant to express a profound, trembling humility. It was a recognition that we do not control the future, that our plans are fragile, and that we submit to the unfolding of the universe.
And what does it mean today? Think about it. If I ask a contractor if my kitchen renovation will be finished by Friday, and he looks at me and says, inshallah, I know for an absolute fact he is not showing up until next Tuesday.
Exactly.
The phrase has been entirely degraded. It has morphed into a polite, culturally acceptable way of saying, I'm probably not going to do it, or we'll see if I feel like it. It has become the ultimate tool for flaking on a commitment.
Exactly. We use the name of the divine to excuse our own laziness. And the exact same assassination happened to the phrase Bismillah in the name of God.
How so?
The speaker explains the deep theology behind this, saying Bismillah before beginning a task is supposed to mean that you are initiating this action with profound divine mercy. It means you are actively committing to doing the task ethically, justly, and with deep care for how it affects others.
Setting a moral intention.
But instead, it has become an empty, superstitious slogan. People mumble it out of sheer habit while doing horrific things.
He gives some shocking real-world examples of this moral decay that just made my jaw drop. He provides examples of people trying to use the deep rituals of faith as a literal money laundering scheme for their guilty consciences.
Oh, this part is wild.
He talks about a high-level government bureaucrat who actively sought to go on the Hajj, the grand sacred pilgrimage to Mecca, specifically because he believed the spiritual cleanse of the trip would erase the sin of the massive, life-ruining bribes he was taking back at his office. He thought he could bribe God with a plane ticket to Mecca.
Or consider the business people he mentions who engage in knowingly illegal, deeply corrupt business deals. They exploit people, they steal, they cheat. But then, to assuage their guilt, they take a 20% cut of their profits, referencing the khums in some Islamic traditions, which is meant for charity, and they donate that stolen 20% to the poor. They genuinely, delusionally believe that paying a 20% religious tax on their corruption somehow magically makes the remaining 80% of their harem illegal money, perfectly halal, pure, and blessed.
It is breathtaking hypocrisy.
Yeah.
It is the mafia boss giving a turkey away on Thanksgiving and thinking he's a saint.
What is truly fascinating and horrifying here is the psychological gymnastics required to maintain that delusion. They are taking the very vocabulary and the sacred rituals of accountability and purposefully turning them into the vocabulary of evasion.
Wow.
When a society does that, its moral compass doesn't just bend, it completely shatters. You can no longer even have a functional conversation about ethics because the words themselves, justice, mercy, God, trust, have been corrupted to mean their exact opposites.
So with all this darkness, with language corrupted and wealth blinding us, how does he bring us back to reality at the end of the lecture? He does something completely unexpected. He doesn't end with a fiery sermon. He ends with a surreal, highly poetic declaration of assets inspired by the famous Turkish poet Can You Sell?
It's a brilliant ending.
Usually, a declaration of assets is a boring legal document where politicians list their bank accounts, their stock portfolios, and their real estate to prove they aren't corrupt. But instead, the speaker lists the actual absurd reality of what a human life truly accumulates by the end.
It is a masterpiece of perspective. He reads this poetic list, claiming his assets are things like a cloud in the sky that I once watched, 18 hair lice from my childhood, 20 empty plastic bags blowing in the wind, 3 bank-sponsored park benches I sat on, and half a lived life left over by my parents.
I absolutely love the surrealism of it. It sounds like nonsense at first, but it hits so hard.
It forces you to realize the grand joke of human accumulation. It makes you realize that at the very end of your life, when you are lying on your deathbed, taking your final breaths, the things you technically owned, the cars, the 180-year mansions, the bank accounts, are utterly absurd.
You can't take them with you.
In the grand scheme of eternity, your stock portfolio is as meaningless and ephemeral as a collection of empty plastic bags or a cloud you once looked at.
And he powerfully contrasts this absurd pile of material junk with the true, lasting legacy of a historical figure named Hasan Ali Yücel, a former Turkish minister of education. What was his asset when he died? What did he leave behind?
Something real.
He spearheaded a massive, grueling project to translate 1,000 global classics, the greatest works of Eastern and Western literature, science, and philosophy, into Turkish, making them freely available to the public. He didn't spend his life building a stone mansion for himself that a stray bullet would keep him from enjoying.
No, he didn't.
He built a permanent intellectual infrastructure for millions of people. That is the definition of stewardship. That is taking your eminent, your trust, and using it to leave something of actual indestructible value.
Which brings our entire deep dive full circle. The material things we hoard with such passion will inevitably vanish. The character we build, the intellect we share, the justice we courageously enact in the face of the herd, that is the only currency that survives the end of the empire.
Okay, let's pull all of these massive threads together, because we have been on an incredible journey today. We started by looking into the dark, blind well of prejudice. We realized that when we refuse to let people evolve, we nail them in time. And in doing so, we condemn ourselves to the exact same static prison.
We examined the profound cowardice of blaming fickle fate, the Felch, or writing off systemic, preventable inequalities in God's ledger, simply to avoid the terrifying responsibility we have to fix them.
We ventured deep into the internal cave. We realized that while isolation is a necessary tool for self-reflection, it is a temporary shelter, not a permanent vacation home. If you don't take the light you find in the cave and bring it back out to eliminate the messy, difficult world, your enlightenment is fake.
We discussed the biological and moral danger of the incubator effect, how isolating yourself from the hardship of the real world destroys your moral immune system, leaving you incapable of truly choosing goodness.
We laughed, and probably cringed a little, at how we all obsess over trivial needlepoint details, stoning the unseen, arguing over PowerPoint fonts, just to avoid confronting the terrifying massive moral choices right in front of us. And finally, we realized that everything we think we own is merely on loan. And trying to carry our wealth is as foolish as a jockey trying to carry a horse.
It has been a complete systematic dismantling of the modern ego.
So I want to speak directly to you, the listener, right now. As you finish this audio and go back to your day, look closely at your own life this week. Are you hiding in an incubator, avoiding the messy, uncomfortable reality of the world around you simply because it is easier?
Good question.
Are you sitting in a meeting or perhaps in a relationship, arguing fiercely over trivial needle-point details just to avoid making a big, scary life change? And when you finally emerge from whatever internal cave you've been resting in, what currency are you carrying back out into the world? Are you just desperately chasing more plastic bags, or are you forging unbreakable character?
And I want to leave you with one final provocative thread to pull, something to really chew on as you navigate the rest of your day. We talked about the companions of the cave. When those sleepers finally woke up after centuries of isolation and went down to the market, they found that their old silver coins were completely useless.
Right, completely obsolete.
The system had changed. The currency was dead. Look around us today. We are all frantically, desperately hoarding a new kind of currency: digital likes, follower counts, retweets, online prestige, and the carefully curated, filtered image of our lives.
The ultimate modern illusion of wealth.
Exactly. So ask yourself this terrifying question. If the metaphorical system reboots tomorrow, if you wake up in a new era, or even just a new phase of your own life where digital clout and social media prestige are suddenly entirely obsolete, what inherent value, what true, unshakable character will you actually have left to trade on? Think about it.
And as you think about that, remember how we started. The next time you feel the overwhelming need to retreat from the noise of the world, make sure you are just stepping into a temporary shelter to find your light. Do not let it become a permanent prison. We'll see you on the next deep dive.
Today, we are critiquing an expansive theological lecture that uses Surah Al-Kahf's 5 narrative layers to challenge modern materialism and superficial piety. Streamlining the conceptual tangents into the core framework is going to significantly amplify the impact of this central exegesis.
Right, because the main weakness we're dealing with right out of the gate is how the narrative frequently jumps from these really profound philosophical concepts to highly specific, emotionally charged contemporary grievances.
Exactly. I mean, 1 minute we're exploring Plato's cave or, Carl Jung's views on complexes, and the next we are suddenly thrown into this rant about a 20,000 lira pension.
Yeah, or the political maneuvers of Iran. Or those corrupt bureaucrats trying to justify their bribes by going on an Umrah pilgrimage?
Right, exactly, those moments. And look, I totally understand why a writer does this. The real world is incredibly frustrating.
Oh, absolutely.
So when you're writing about high-minded moral action, the temptation to just vent about the blatant hypocrisy you see on the news is, well, it's overwhelming.
It really is.
But you're saying the weakness is that these anecdotes, vivid as they are, basically act as a centrifuge.
Yes, a centrifuge. They literally spin the audience away from the promised exploration of the ancient text. They pull the reader's attention outward into the chaotic modern world instead of, drawing them deeper into the spiritual framework.
I do want to push back on that, just slightly, though. I mean, aren't those vivid, angry anecdotes exactly what keeps a modern reader engaged?
How so?
Well, if you just stay in the realm of ancient philosophy, you risk sounding like a dusty textbook. The bit about the corrupt bureaucrat using a religious pilgrimage to launder his conscience, that is punchy. Like, it grounds the theology in something I can actually recognize.
It is punchy, I'll definitely give you that. But let me offer an analogy here. Think of a brilliant jazz solo.
Okay, I'm listening.
The improvisation is thrilling. The notes are sharp. The passion is absolutely there. But if the soloist plays for 10 minutes and completely forgets the bass tempo, you lose the underlying song entirely.
Right, you stop listening to the song and you're just listening to a guy playing notes.
Exactly. The risk here is that the audience remembers the intense anger over the corrupt bureaucrat, but completely forgets the actual lesson of the 2 gardens that the anecdote was supposed to illustrate. So the critique isn't about removing the modern world, it's about how it's integrated.
Okay, I see the distinction you're making. So, if the weakness is that the tangents are acting as an independent centrifuge, the suggestion for improvement would be to anchor these modern sociological observations firmly to the structural pillars of the lecture.
Precisely. We need to make them load-bearing columns for the theological argument, rather than just isolated venting sessions.
That makes sense.
Yeah, if we bring them back to the core framework, they stop being distractions and start doing the heavy lifting for the thesis. Let's look at some concrete examples of how we can actually execute that on the page.
Let's do it.
Early in the material, the author critiques the superficiality of debating the granular mechanics of washing your heels during ablution, or arguing over the exact number of sleepers in the historical cave.
Right, the author is clearly frustrated by people obsessing over religious minutia instead of, focusing on actual moral integrity.
But right now, it just reads as a complaint. To fix this, we can explicitly position this modern frustration under the first layer of the text's framework, the maqara, or the cave layer.
Oh, I see where you're going.
Yeah. The text references the concept of stoning the unseen, or rakman bil gaib, which essentially means throwing stones into the dark, making baseless guesses, or just obsessing over things you can't possibly know.
That is a fascinating concept. So instead of just complaining about people arguing over the number of sleepers, the author could frame that exact argument as a modern manifestation of stoning the unseen?
Precisely. You explicitly label this modern obsession with trivial details as a way of hiding in a conceptual cave to avoid real moral action. Suddenly, the tangent serves the metaphor of the cave.
Taking that a step further, let's look at the geopolitical tangents. There's a whole section complaining about Iran and regional sectarianism that just feels completely disconnected from the spiritual exegesis.
It really does stick out.
Right, but earlier, the material discusses the concept of mahalle baskısından özgürlük, which translates to freedom from neighborhood pressure, or tribal expectations.
Yes. The author explores this beautifully during a segment about Han's prayer, where she dedicates her child to God, entirely free from the societal expectations of her community.
Exactly. So what if you tie the geopolitical rant directly to that specific psychological failing?
Oh, that's good.
If the author explicitly connects the geopolitical sectarianism to the inability to break free from the neighborhood mindset, it fundamentally changes the nature of the tangent.
It does. You aren't just reading a political opinion anymore. You're looking at a geopolitical manifestation of a spiritual disease.
Exactly. These are just a few ways to weave the modern commentary directly into the ancient framework. When you do this, the reader realizes the modern world is just another level of the cave you're exploring together.
That totally transforms the material from a lecture interspersed with grievances into a unified, piercing critique of the human condition, modulating the transition between deep spiritual reflection and cynical satire is absolutely necessary to prevent the audience from experiencing severe tonal whiplash.
Total whiplash is the perfect way to describe it. The weakness is really how drastically the piece swings from serene, almost poetic vulnerability to biting, sarcastic mockery with zero transition.
Give me an example of where you felt that whiplash most acutely.
Well, early on, there is this beautiful breakdown of the Basmala's layers of mercy. And then the author introduces this incredibly moving concept of Hira, not just as a physical, historical cave, but as a cave of search.
Right, a place of internal seeking and profound grace.
Opens themselves up to that vulnerability. But then, almost in the next breath, the text pivots to mocking modern Sweetwater Muslims.
Let's clarify that idiom for a moment, just because it's crucial to understanding the tone. Tatlısu Musulmani, Sweetwater Muslims, essentially refers to fair-weather believers.
People whose faith has never been tested by the salt water of real hardship.
Right, and the author just skewers them. They mock people who use the phrase inshallah merely as a tool for procrastination. And the whole piece eventually concludes with Can Neuchal's highly cynical poem, Mal Biyani, The Declaration of Wealth.
Yeah, concluding on a list of absurd hollow possessions from that poem. Things like 3 apartments, 18 hair lice, 6 swear words. It leaves the audience with a mood of satirical exhaustion.
It completely overrides the spiritual empowerment that the opening promised.
I do wonder, though, what the author's intention was here. Satire is an incredibly effective tool for waking people up.
It is.
If you just stay in that serene, poetic space, the reader might get lulled to sleep. The sarcasm is a bucket of cold water.
It is a bucket of cold water, but we have to look at how that functions psychologically for the reader. When you invite someone to open their heart to a profound concept and then immediately hit them with biting sarcasm, their natural response is to raise their defenses.
That's true, yeah.
Interestingly, the text itself provides the perfect metaphor for what the author is doing. The author uses the concept of an incubator, a kuvos, to describe sheltered individuals who haven't developed spiritual immunity because they hide from the harsh realities of the real world.
Oh, that is interesting. Are you suggesting the author is using satire as their own incubator?
I am, yeah. I think the intense defensive sarcasm actually acts as an emotional incubator for the speaker.
Wow.
Writing earnestly about spirituality is a highly vulnerable act. Sarcasm is a shield. By leaning so heavily into cynical mockery, the author is effectively putting the audience inside a cynical incubator where earnest spiritual growth just cannot breathe.
They are protecting themselves from the vulnerability of their own subject matter. That is a brilliant diagnosis of the underlying mechanics.
Thank you. But we don't want the author to lose the edge of their critique, because that edge is what makes the piece compelling.
Right, so the suggestion for improvement here is to blend the critical sarcasm into the philosophical inquiry by framing the absurdities not as punchlines, but as tragic manifestations of the spiritual concepts being discussed. We need to change the emotional resonance of that edge from mockery to mourning.
Let's run through some concrete examples of how to shift that emotional resonance on the page. Take the ending.
Okay.
Instead of concluding abruptly on the cynical list of the Can You Sell poem, the 3 apartments and the hair lice, we use that poem as a direct transition into a final earnest call to action.
But how do we bridge the cynicism of the poem into an earnest call to action without it feeling, forced?
Well, you present the poem, you acknowledge the absolute absurdity of these hollow possessions, and then you pivot the lens back onto the reader.
Okay, so you ask a question?
Exactly. You ask, is this the inventory of our own inner cave? Or are these the shadows on the wall that we are mistaking for reality?
By explicitly connecting the satire of the poem back to the foundational metaphor of Plato's cave and the cave of Al-Kahf, the cynicism just dissolves. It becomes a powerful, introspective challenge.
Exactly. It fundamentally alters the aftertaste of the piece. It restores the spiritual weight. Let's apply that same logic to the critique of how people use inshallah to dodge responsibilities.
Right, the author currently uses it to mock the laziness of the modern speaker.
It's basically written as a joke at the expense of hypocrites. To fix it, we frame the mockery of inshallah as a sincere, tragic loss of the concept of izn Allah, which means God's permission. Keep the tone melancholic.
So instead of saying, look at how foolish these lazy people are, you pivot to, look at what a profound philosophical tool we have carelessly lost.
Yes!
You lament the fact that a phrase meant to acknowledge the divine, uncontrollable architecture of the universe has been reduced to a cheap lockpick for skipping out on work.
Exactly. These concrete adjustments help move the emotional journey for the listener. They ensure that the critical observations enhance the spiritual depth rather than undercutting it with cheap shots. Rebalancing the time allocation across the declared framework is the only way to ensure the intellectual promises made to the audience are actually delivered.
The setup in this piece is incredibly clear, which makes the execution so frustrating. Early in the text, the author establishes a highly compelling roadmap.
They do.
They tell the reader, look, Surah Al-Kahf consists of 5 distinct narrative layers. You have the cave, the 2 gardens, Adam and Iblis, Musa and the sage, and finally Dhul-Qarnayn.
Right.
As a reader, I immediately mentally prepare myself for a 5-act journey. I know exactly where we're going.
But the weakness is that the execution gets completely bogged down in the first 2 layers. The author spends so much time exploring every single intricacy of the cave and the 2 gardens that they effectively abandon the promised deep dives into the final 3 layers.
They absolutely do. We never get to fully explore the nuanced discussions regarding good and evil, the states of knowledge, or power and justice that were explicitly promised in the opening pages. You could almost feel the clock running out on the material.
Let's talk about why writers fall into this trap, because it's a very common psychological hurdle. It's essentially structural front-loading.
Right, where you just dump everything at the start.
Exactly. A writer dives into their research, they are incredibly passionate about their first few points, and they pour thousands of words into the early sections.
By the time they get to the latter half of their outline, they're either emotionally exhausted, or they realize they've vastly exceeded their intended word count, so they just rush the ending.
It creates a massive sense of intellectual unfulfillment for the reader.
It's like building a beautiful 5-story house, inviting guests over for a grand tour, but only giving them the keys to the first 2 floors.
That's a great way to put it.
You walk your guests through every single corner of the living room. You show them the crown molding in the kitchen on floors 1 and 2. But by the time you're done, the tour is over. Your guests are left standing on the staircase, looking up, wondering what was waiting for them on the upper levels.
I have to ask, though, could this structural abandonment have been an intentional meta-choice?
What do you mean?
Well, the whole piece is about how humanity gets stuck in the cave of initial thoughts and superficiality. What if the author intentionally left the reader stuck in the first 2 layers to prove that very point?
I mean, if it is a meta-choice, it's missing the neon sign pointing that out. Meta-commentary only works if you explicitly signal to the reader that you are breaking the rules on purpose.
That's fair. Without that signal, the reader just assumes you ran out of time or didn't edit your work.
Exactly. Assuming it is a pacing oversight, the structural suggestion is straightforward. You need to audit the pacing of the first half to ruthlessly trim repetitive anecdotes. You have to carve out the necessary space to complete the 5-part structure.
Let's identify exactly where they can carve out that space. We need concrete examples of what to cut.
Okay.
There is a lengthy, highly granular section detailing the specific phrasing of the sleepers in the cave. The material loops through the historical and textual debates like, were they 3 and a dog, 5 and a dog, 7 and a dog?
And it goes on for paragraphs. The author is trying to prove a point about how humanity focuses on the wrong things, but by spending so much time detailing the triviality, the text itself falls victim to over-explaining the triviality.
Right, it becomes exactly what it is critiquing.
That is a highly actionable cut. That entire section detailing the math of the dog can be reduced to a single, sharp sentence.
Just cut it all out.
Yeah, you just say, humanity has historically obsessed over the trivial arithmetic of the sleepers, entirely missing the spiritual substance of their retreat. Boom. You've made the point, and you've saved yourself hundreds of words.
And what do you do with those saved words? You invest them in the back half of the house.
Exactly. You use that saved space to introduce the Musa and Khidr layer, connecting it to the concept of the states of knowledge that was teased early on. You take the time you were spending on the math of the dog, and you invest it in the philosophy of wisdom.
But what if the author disagrees? What if they feel that the deep, granular dive into the first 2 layers is like the absolute soul of the critique, and cutting the dog math or the 2 gardens minutiae would destroy the integrity of the piece?
That is a completely valid artistic choice, but it requires a different structural fix. If you absolutely cannot trim the first half, the suggestion is to revise your opening promise.
Oh, I see. Change the roadmap.
Yes. You go back to the introduction, and you explicitly state that while the text contains 5 layers, today's focus will only be a deep extraction of the first 2. You tell the reader you are saving the remaining 3 for a future installment.
That is fundamentally about managing the reader's cognitive load.
Exactly.
If you tell them up front, we're only exploring 2 floors today, they settle in. They deeply appreciate the living room and the kitchen without constantly anticipating the stairs to the 3rd floor. It honors the contract you make with the reader at the start.
Exactly. When the architecture of the piece aligns with the depth of the philosophy, the impact is just unstoppable. So to summarize the critical path forward for this material, first, anchor the contemporary geopolitical and social tangents firmly to the theological framework, so they act as supporting evidence rather than distracting centrifuges.
Second, smooth out the tonal whiplash. Blend the cynical satire into the philosophical inquiry by framing those modern absurdities as tragic manifestations of spiritual loss, moving the tone from mockery to earnest mourning.
And finally, manage the pacing. Either ruthlessly trim the front-loaded anecdotes to ensure the initial promise of exploring all 5 layers is fulfilled, or revise the introduction to promise a deep dive into only the first 2.
Implementing these structural and tonal adjustments will ensure the profound insights of this piece actually hit their mark.
The raw material here is incredibly rich, and we invite the listener to apply these concepts and submit their revised work or entirely new materials for a future critique.
Welcome to the debate. You know, there is this really profound psychological shift that happens the moment you lock your front door at the end of a chaotic, exhausting day.
Oh, absolutely. The noise just drops off.
Right, the noise of the city gets muffled, the barrage of notifications on your phone can finally be ignored, and for this brief window, you are entirely self-contained. It's a nearly universal human reflex to seek out that sanctuary. We all know that feeling of wanting to just, well, shut it all out.
We absolutely do, but I always argue that there is a razor-thin line between a sanctuary and a quarantine ward.
A quarantine ward?
Yeah, I mean, you lock that door to keep the chaos out, sure, but if you stay inside too long, you start breathing recycled air. The very walls that protect you eventually strip you of your resistance to the outside world, and suddenly you're not resting, you're hiding.
And that precise tension is exactly what we are unpacking today. We're drawing from the deep philosophical and historical analysis of the narrative of the caves, specifically from the tradition of the Surah Al-Kahf.
Right.
What we're really looking at is the fundamental human conflict between withdrawing from a deeply corrupt society in order to preserve your moral compass versus the stark necessity of remaining engaged with that messy, flawed world to actually forge those moral convictions.
It comes down to a question of moral survival, doesn't it? We're looking at whether retreating into a personal cave, whatever that looks like for you today, is a necessary act of spiritual liberation, or if it inevitably creates a sterile, moral incubator that completely destroys our ethical immune system.
Exactly. And for my part, I look at the concept of the cave as the ultimate psychological and spiritual sanctuary. I don't see it as hiding at all. I see it as a strategic, essential retreat to kindle and protect your inner light against the overwhelming, suffocating darkness of a corrupt mass.
And I look at that exact same retreat and see a massive psychological trap. I think seeking out that moral safe space inherently risks becoming a dangerous comfort zone. It strips individuals of the very friction they need to actually choose goodness in the face of active evil.
You think it makes morality an illusion?
I do. Without that friction, your morality is just a theoretical illusion.
Well, let's start by decoupling the idea of the cave from our standard, somewhat cynical Western view of isolation. Because when most of us hear the word cave, our minds immediately go to Plato's cave.
Oh, sure, the shadows on the wall? Right. In Plato's allegory, the cave is a prison of ignorance. It's a place where humanity is chained, staring at those shadows completely divorced from the sunlight of reality. But the analysis of the companions of the cave presents the exact inverse of that.
It flips the dynamic.
It completely flips it. Here, the cave isn't the prison. Society is the prison, and the cave represents freedom.
Which is a fascinating inversion, really. It redefines what it means to be trapped.
Exactly. It represents enlightenment and a deliberate return to one's true essence. And there's a crucial distinction made here regarding the state of the outside world. The material differentiates between a normal night and what it calls zalam.
Right, the absolute darkness. Yes. Now, a normal night is just darkness. It can be illuminated by a single candle. You know, you can fight a normal darkness from within. But zalam is an absolute light-absorbing darkness. Think of it like a black hole or the vacuum of space.
It's impenetrable.
Penetration isn't even the issue. It's that it absorbs everything. It is a societal corruption so dense, so normalized, that it simply absorbs whatever tiny light you try to emit. When a society's established order reaches that state of absolute density, withdrawing to kindle your internal light is not some cowardly act of escapism. Mathematically speaking, it is the only way to avoid being entirely consumed by the darkness.
I see the appeal of that framework. I really do. The intention of that withdrawal sounds incredibly noble. It sounds like enlightenment, but we have to look at the practical reality of human psychology, which usually turns that noble retreat into something far more dangerous.
How so?
Well, to counter your black hole metaphor, I want to lean into a brilliant medical analogy from the material that I think perfectly captures the danger of this isolation: the kuvos, or the sterile incubator.
Okay, walk us through that.
Think about how an incubator works in a hospital. If you take a child and place them in a completely sterile, perfectly controlled environment, entirely protected from every microbe, every speck of dust, every virus, you aren't actually making that child healthy.
You're protecting them temporarily.
Temporarily, maybe. but over time you are actively preventing the development of their immune system. By removing the friction of the biological world, you are manufacturing extreme fragility. And I argue the exact same thing happens to our moral framework.
You're saying we need the moral microbes, essentially.
Exactly. A person who completely removes themselves from the friction of society, who curates their life so perfectly that they remove the very possibility of encountering evil or temptation, well, they cannot truly be considered good.
Because they've never had to prove it.
Precisely. This touches on the core of the theodicy problem, the whole philosophical debate around the existence of evil. Why does evil exist? Well, if you eliminate the possibility of doing evil, your goodness is just an illusion.
It's untested.
Right. True goodness isn't a passive state of not doing bad things. It is an active, heavily tested choice made in the actual presence of temptation and corruption. When you retreat to the incubator, whether that's a gated community, an incredibly insulated social media echo chamber, or a literal mountain retreat, you are trading authentic, resilient morality for a highly fragile, completely untested purity.
I hear the danger you're pointing out, but I think you're mischaracterizing the actual mechanics of this withdrawal. You're acting like any isolation is an incubator that creates absolute fragility.
It often is.
But let's take your medical metaphor and extend it to how we actually build immunity in the real world. We don't build immunity by taking a vulnerable patient and throwing them into the middle of a bubonic plague ward without any protection, hoping they survive.
No, obviously not, but we don't lock them in a bubble forever either.
Right. We use vaccines. And what is a vaccine? By definition, it is a controlled exposure to a pathogen in a safe environment. The cave functions precisely as that controlled environment.
I see where you're going with this. Let's bring this back to our modern lives. If you are constantly bombarded by the toxic norms of a hyper-consumerist, deeply superficial society, that absolute darkness we talked about, diving headfirst into it every single day doesn't make you morally strong.
It just wears you down.
It makes you exhausted, cynical, and eventually corrupt. You need the cave, the withdrawal, to develop the foundational strength, the antibodies of character, if you will. You cannot build immunity if the virus overwhelms your system before your inner light is strong enough to fight back.
Okay, that's a clever pivot with the vaccine analogy, I'll admit. But here's where that falls apart in practice. A vaccine is a temporary, highly calibrated, one-time intervention. You get the shot, your body processes it, and you go back out into the world.
Which is what the cave is supposed to be.
Supposed to be, yes. But the tragedy of the cave is that human beings don't want to go back out. The retreat almost always metastasizes from a temporary vaccine into a permanent lifestyle.
You think people just inevitably get stuck there?
Yeah, I do. When people find a comfort zone, they don't use it to build strength and return to the fray. They furnish the cave. They put up wallpaper. They lock the door and swallow the key.
So you think the natural human tendency is just to hide permanently?
I think it's the natural tendency of people who believe they are morally superior. They decide that the friction of dealing with difficult, flawed, messy human beings is beneath them. We see this all the time today.
With echo chambers, you mean?
Exactly. People delete their news apps, they curate their feeds, they move to enclaves where everyone thinks exactly like them, and they call it self-care or protecting their peace. But the initial protective measure becomes a permanent state of moral atrophy.
They mistake the absence of conflict for virtue.
Perfectly said. They mistake the absence of visible conflict in their life for the presence of actual virtue. It's incredibly convenient to sit in a beautifully curated, isolated space, engaging in high-minded self-reflection, while completely ignoring the physical suffering happening outside your door. You convince yourself that your intellectual withdrawal is a higher calling, when in reality it's just an elaborate defense mechanism.
Let me stop you right there, because the framework we are discussing explicitly guards against that permanent atrophy. The historical precedent here and the philosophical mandate is that the ultimate defining goal of the cave is to leave it.
In theory.
No, in practice, if done correctly. Think of the historical example of the prophet's retreat to the Cave of Hira. It wasn't about staying there. The very linguistic root of Hira is connected to the concept of the search, tahari.
Right, the seeking.
It's an active accounting of the soul, what is historically termed a deep moral self-accounting.
But the absolute imperative that follows that retreat is arise and warn, qum fa'anzir. The cave is a temporary inn. It is never meant to be a permanent dwelling.
But what happens when people inevitably ignore that imperative? Because they do.
They absolutely do, and the analysis provides a brilliant psychological observation about what happens when people refuse to leave the cave. When they fail to return to society, they begin to obsess over utter trivialities. It's a phenomenon perfectly described in the material as needlepoint piety.
Needlepoint piety. I really like that translation.
It's the perfect image, isn't it? The source material points out how people will sit around endlessly debating historical minutiae, like arguing aggressively over whether there were exactly 3, 5, or 7 sleepers in the cave.
Missing the entire point of the narrative.
Completely. Or, in a modern context, arguing over microscopic, esoteric rules of daily rituals on internet forums, essentially shrinking their entire moral universe to the size of a pinhead. And this isn't just innocent foolishness. As you hinted at earlier, it's a subconscious defense mechanism.
It's a distraction technique.
Exactly. By turning morality into a highly technical, esoteric academic debate over trivial details, they completely absolve themselves of the terrifying, monumental duty of confronting real-world injustice.
Right.
If I am arguing with you about the exact millimeter placement of my hands during a ritual, I don't have to look out the window and address the systemic poverty in my city.
I completely agree that triviality is a massive symptom of a failed retreat, but if we are really looking at the consequences, the material points to something far darker than just wasting time on esoteric debates. It points to the active weaponization of the cave.
Weaponization in what sense?
In the sense that people don't just use the cave to avoid the world, they use it to justify their active corruption in the world.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. When people isolate their morality from their daily actions, they begin to use these isolated rituals as a moral loophole. The text provides devastating examples of this psychological fracturing. It talks about individuals who believe a ritual bath can somehow spiritually cleanse the active, ongoing harm they are causing others.
Treating it like a transaction.
Exactly like a transaction. To put it in a modern context, imagine a corrupt CEO who actively exploits their workforce, pollutes the environment, and destroys communities. But then they go on a silent meditation retreat for 2 weeks and believe they are spiritually cleansed.
They compartmentalize.
Worse than compartmentalize, they use the retreat as an accomplice. They plan their purification alongside their corruption. They think, I can engage in bribery and exploitation because next year I will go on a pilgrimage or do a grand charitable gesture that washes it all away.
That is bleak.
It is. And this is the ultimate danger of the incubator mindset. The isolated ritual becomes their personal cave, and it gives them a blank check to participate in the decay of society. They believe they are above the rot when in fact they are the ones spreading it.
That weaponization is a profound perversion of the concept. Absolutely. And it's a terrifying psychological trap. But I would argue that is exactly why the proper use of the cave is so critical. We can't throw out the necessity of the sanctuary just because some people turn it into a loophole.
Okay, so what does the proper use look like then?
Let's look at what genuine, successful engagement with the world actually looks like when someone steps out of the cave properly, having truly kindled their inner light.
I'm curious what you think that successful re-entry looks like, practically speaking.
Well, it completely changes your relationship with the material world. The philosophical framework addresses this through the concept of treating worldly possessions, power, and influence as a trust rather than an absolute ownership. Eminent rather than mulkiyet.
Right, stewardship.
Stewardship, exactly. When you have successfully done the hard work of moral accounting in the sanctuary, you return to the world with a vital sense of equanimity.
Meaning you aren't swayed by the highs and lows?
Precisely. You can navigate extreme wealth, immense power, or severe poverty without being corrupted by any of them, because your core identity was forged in the quiet of the cave, away from the applause or the condemnation of the crowd.
You're insulated from the ego traps.
Yes. You recognize that the things of this world are today present and tomorrow gone. If you gain a fortune, your soul doesn't inflate with arrogance. If you lose it all tomorrow, your soul doesn't shatter into despair. You are unchanged by their abundance and unbroken by their absence. The cave is what allows you to engage with the highly infectious material world without becoming a slave to it.
That sounds incredibly peaceful. It sounds like a perfect Stoic ideal. But I have to push back on this idea of equanimity, because I think true engagement with the world requires something much more visceral than just a polite, detached navigation of wealth and power.
You don't think being uncorrupted by power is enough?
I think the way you're framing it still treats the world as something to be held at arm's length, and the material itself subverts this traditional Stoic idea of engagement. It concludes with a brilliant reference to a concept known as the Declaration of Wealth, Malbayani, and it completely redefines what it means to be engaged with reality.
Contrast that for us then.
Well, think about the arrogance of the classic wealthy figure in the text, the man who builds massive, walled-off gardens, hoards his resources, and thinks his sterile, protected wealth will last forever. That is the ultimate manifestation of the incubator mindset.
He isolates his wealth.
Yes.
He has achieved his perfect equanimity by building a fortress. But the Declaration of Wealth concept argues that true wealth isn't what you can lock away in a vault. True wealth is the raw, shared, unfiltered experiences of life.
Shared experiences.
Yes. A passing cloud in the sky. 3 stray cats on a street corner. The sound of a bird's wings. A shared, battered bench heavily plastered with municipal advertisements.
The everyday things.
The everyday communal things. This is a massive philosophical shift. True engagement isn't about standing above the world with perfect, detached equanimity so you don't get your hands dirty. It is about embracing the friction, the messiness, and the shared vulnerability of the human condition.
Engaging deeply.
Exactly. You don't own life from a distance, you participate in it deeply, side by side with everyone else. That raw, unprotected, empathetic engagement is the only true antidote to the sterile incubator.
I see the beauty in that shared vulnerability, I really do. But I still maintain that you cannot meaningfully participate in that shared vulnerability if you don't know who you are in the first place.
Fair enough.
My position remains that the internal cave is an absolutely indispensable mechanism. We live in an era of relentless noise, constant performative outrage, and deeply embedded systemic corruption. Without a deliberate strategic withdrawal, without taking the time for deep self-accounting away from the gaze of the crowd, we risk being entirely consumed by the established order.
You think we just get swept away?
We do. We have to preserve our inner light before we can ever hope to illuminate the darkness for anyone else.
And while I respect the need to find one's center, I maintain that we must remain intensely, almost aggressively vigilant against the perpetual danger of that cave. Its gravitational pull is always toward a permanent comfort zone.
It is tempting to stay inside.
Extremely tempting. If we isolate ourselves in that sterile incubator, if we curate our lives so perfectly that we never encounter friction, we completely strip away our moral immunity. Without the constant, uncomfortable, messy engagement with real-world flaws and real-world suffering, our proclaimed goodness remains untested, fragile, and ultimately hollow.
Yet amidst this profound tension, I think we find a very clear point of convergence directly from the foundational ideas we've discussed today. The cave holds true value only if it is eventually abandoned.
Exactly right. A sanctuary that you never leave isn't a sanctuary at all. It's just a beautifully decorated prison.
This tension between the deep human need to protect our values and the absolute unyielding mandate to test them in the real world is one of the most enduring philosophical struggles we face, and the narrative offers profound further layers for listeners to explore on their own.
Oh, definitely.
For instance, the deeply complex allegory of the journey with the sage, which examines the very limits of human knowledge and the danger of snap moral judgments. There is so much more to unpack in the source material.
It's a framework that forces us to constantly ask ourselves a very uncomfortable question. Are we retreating to heal, or are we retreating to hide?
Which brings us right back to that locked front door we started with. When you turn the deadbolt tonight, and you finally shut out the chaos of the city and the noise of the world, take just a moment to ask yourself, are you stepping into a sanctuary to catch your breath so you can fight another day? Or have you slowly, quietly forgotten how to breathe the outside air?